Hi everyone, my name is Savannah Maddox, and this is my presentation called Comparing the Biographical Framework of Various Works of Gregory Tours and Vita, Patrum, Jurensium. Hi everyone, my name is Savannah Maddox, and this is my presentation called Comparing the Biographical Framework of Various Works of Gregory Tours and Vita, Patrum, Jurensium. This presentation is going to examine if Gregory, the Bishop of Tours, is possibly using or reusing biographical framework from a work written by an anonymous author nearly half a century earlier, around 520 AD, known as the Vita Patrum Jurensium. This suspicion comes from the biographical similarities that occur for a different person in Tors's work called Historia Francorum, which Tours wrote in the late 6th century. This will be done by specifically looking at the biographical stories mentioned for Agrippinus and Childeric I. Also, an examination of both authors' writings on the life of St. Lupicinius will be done in order to help contextualize possible influences Tours may have had. This slide includes the biographical points which are similar for Agrippinus and Childeric. Some characteristics to note are both men's military backgrounds, how both men's characters were redeemed by an elite married woman, how Aegidius becomes the successor to their domains, and the important role coinage played in their returns. There are many reasons why these types of similarities could matter. The most obvious reason for significance comes from the realization that Agrippinus and Childeric can be considered major figures in Gaul during the mid-5th century. Both their positions as king and magister militium per Gallus means that they both had troops under their respective commands. It's rather odd that these two men in the same region and time period have similar structural biography stories. Such a peculiar observation that any good academic would stop and re-examine their source material. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the details which are different for the interaction of Childeric II and Lupicinius. The Jura Fathers was written by an unknown author around 520 AD, before Tours was even born in 538. What this means is this author is probably writing a second-hand account, but they're still closer to the time in which these events occurred rather than Tours. In 520, the material will be written about a decade after Clovis's death in 511. So the Merovingian dynasty was established at that point. The story involving Agrippinus is 14 chapters long, which is the longest story in the section of St. Lupicinius, which spans 55 chapters. While it's odd to have a fourth of Lupicinius's book dedicated to a Roman general, stories involving other political figures connected to the Merovingian dynasty occur, like Childeric II, who was the king of the Burgundians and the father-in-law to Clovis. Tours also wrote on St. Lupicinius as well. However, there's a noticeable difference between the two works, because in the Lives of the Fathers, Tours only writes 6 chapters on St. Lupicinius, combined with his brother, St. Romanus. The Childeric depicted in Tours seems humble and susceptible to divine intervention, which makes sense seeing as that he's the father of Collatide, the picturesque Christian wife of Clovis. Not at all like the Childeric who was trading character assaults with an old monk in the Jura Fathers. The first is the nature in which they received their information. There's a time difference of almost half a century between when these two works are written. In the Jura Fathers, the author explicitly says that he does not doubt that the old will remember this occurrence with Agrippinus, while Tours is writing about 100 years removed from the event, so no one is alive from that period. Tours may even be using the Jura Fathers as a source of information since it predates his own work. If this is the case, then this could be a possible explanation for why both works seem more biographical in comparison to the other hagiographies of this period, which mostly consist of miracle stories. The third is that Tours may have censored himself or could be the same person. Tours was a bishop, and anything that could have been counterproductive to the narrative he was trying to craft could be left out. This concept called dualistic identity. Franks was the conversion of Clovis were referred to as a Roman name, typically in public, and a Gallic or Germanic name in private. Think of it as a fluid situational identity. He's writing under the Merovingian dynasty, after it's been established. Any information that would have been harmful to its founders could have been withheld on purpose. The second is that Agrippinus and Childeric could be the same person. In Erica Buchbeger's book on shifting ethnic identities in Spain and Gaul, she proposes this concept called dualistic identity, where Gallo-Romans were referred to as a Roman name, typically in public, and a Gallic or Germanic name in private. Think of it as a fluid situational identity. In conclusion, Tours uses a biographical framework similar to that of Vita, Patrum, Jurensium. This comes from looking at the biographical similarities that occur from looking at the stories for Agrippinus and Childeric, such as both men's military backgrounds, how both men's characters were redeemed by an elite married woman, how Aegidius becomes successor to both their domains, and the important role coinage played in their returns. Also, through brief examination of both authors' writings on the life of St. Lupicinius, obvious differences can be seen between both authors' selections of pertinent information. The work's temporal differences are apparent, especially with Tours, as chronology, occupation, authorial intent, accessibility of sources, and regional politics are all viable explanations for the differences. Also, here are my bibliographical citations.